In Essential Task 6.1, we are going to define the field of developmental psychology and talk about how psychologists study the human lifespan. We're going to be talking about specifically two different types of studies. I think this horizontal works the best vertically. There's the box here at the top defining developmental psychology, which is really short. And then we're going to talk about two separate types of research methods. I will return now back to the text of the task, allowing you to copy down the portion in yellow. So when we talk about developmental psychology, or we talk about developmental psychologists, we are going to talk about individuals who essentially study humans from, and this might sound a little weird, from womb to tomb. Not the most formal definition, but that's really what a developmental psychologist does. They study human development from the moment of conception all the way up through birth, and then from birth all the way through death. We're going to be talking about how cognitive skills develop, how social interactions affect our development, how our morals potentially develop. We're going to be talking about the maturation of motor skills or movement. We're essentially going to be tracking how humans shift from the moment of birth all the way up to the moment of death. There are two primary methods that developmental psychologists use in order to study the development, whether it's of children, middle age, or the elderly. Doesn't matter. Those are cross-sectional and longitudinal studies. We'll first begin with what are called cross-sectional studies. This occurs when developmental psychologists identify various ages and study each of those different ages all at the same time. So, for example, if we were to conduct a cross-sectional study, let's say we were curious about morality, the topic of morals, we would have a population of, let's say, 15-year-olds, 25-year-olds, 35-year-olds, 45-year-olds, and we would conduct our study today, or perhaps over the course of a week. Meaning we would get one snapshot in time. This video is being recorded in 2020, so we could conduct this study at the end of 2020, and we would get a snapshot in time about how morality differed, at least at the end of 2020, across these 3 or 4 or 5 different age groups. It's relatively inexpensive and quick to do this. We could, if we have the resources to do so, conduct a cross-sectional study in a couple days. So it's a very valuable tool. One of the issues here is this does not account for what are called cohort differences, unique differences between each of those age groups that this type of study doesn't really account for. So, for example, if we talked about morality between 15-year-olds, 25-year-olds, 35-year-olds, and so on, one of the variables that's really hard to keep track of are differences in life experience, shifts in culture, shifts in things like technology. So, for example, the questions of morality and how a 15-year-old approaches morality could be very deeply affected by the fact that they lived their entire lives in the technology age, perhaps playing video games and apps. And if you were to ask questions about morality to somebody who's 65, 75, or 85, who have perhaps lived through the Vietnam War, the Korean War, lived through certainly 9/11 and some of the war on terror, you might get differing reactions to the question of morality. And the reason for that might be more of a byproduct of cultural life differences as opposed to necessarily the development of, in some cases, for example, their brain. Developmental psychologists really want to confidently say the 15-year-old difference to a 20-year-old, the differences between those two ages is a result of something like brain development. And we need to find a way of proving that the human body develops in such a way that a question like morality might shift. When this type of study is conducted, it's really hard to definitively say the differences between each of these ages is due to age and not necessarily cohort differences. As we'll talk about in just a moment, there's a way of sort of eliminating or reducing the possibility of things like technology, life experiences, cultural differences, shifts in attitudes. We'll talk about that in just a moment. But nevertheless, this is a quick, fairly inexpensive method of studying information related to age. This is an abstract and a screenshot of a study on beer and obesity, a cross-sectional study where different ages, men and women, were divided up. We're talking about the ages of 25 to 64, answered a selection of questions and questionnaires, and then now we can differentiate between each of these groupings. So, for example, let's say you had a little bit about 2,300 participants randomly selected. Then you can divide that up by gender. You can divide that up by drinker or non-drinker. You could divide this up again by age. And what you would do, that study was conducted a few years ago, but you could get a snapshot in time of the differences between each of these, what we call cohorts, drinkers and non-drinkers, male and female, and then you can even divide that up by ages. So you get this little snapshot in time, allowing you to tell whether or not there are any differences between each of these cohorts or groups. This is valuable, but again, it doesn't do a great job tracking whether or not there are differences pertaining to the topic that you're studying. That has to do more with cultural experience, life experiences, technology shifts, etc. So we have a second type of study. We've actually referenced this type of study before, but now we're going to formally define it. These are called longitudinal studies, where we get a group of people and we study those exact same participants over a long period of time. So, for example, we're going to have 2,500 participants. We are going to ask them questions on day one, and then we're going to follow up a year later and ask them maybe the same questions, related questions, a different series of questions. Doesn't matter, but we're going to track those same 2,500 people after 1 year, 2 years, 10 years, 30 years. We are going to track the exact same people from the moment the study begins to the moment the study ends. We talked about a longitudinal study back when we discussed psychometrics or intelligence testing. We talked about Thurman's longitudinal study, who took gifted children and tracked them for the entirety of their life, detecting that there really was no major difference. They lived happy, successful lives. There was, at least at one point in time, that the notion of high IQ and giftedness sort of had a negative connotation to it. Well, a longitudinal study was designed to track that. Would gifted children at a young age grow up to live unsatisfying lives? Nope, that was not the case. But that's an example of a longitudinal study. You have the same group of people, and they all age. They live through the same wars. They live through the same technological changes. They live through the same cultural shifts. And when you track the same group of people, you become more confident that any differences that you see are actually a result of age. So this eliminates those cohort differences. So again, if we were to study morality with 2,500 people, all let's say at the age of 15, over the course of 50 years, we would be more confident that shifts in moral thinking were a result of their actual age as opposed to what technology they live through, because they're going to live through all the same technological changes. They're going to live through all the same cultural changes. They're going to live through all the same wars. They're all going to experience the same life events, which makes it partially more definitive that any shifts in morality are in fact due to age. So you get a very detailed telling of developmental changes, because there are significant changes that occur in the brain, specifically the prefrontal cortex, that occur in your early 20s. And if we have all of these participants age through their 20s at the same time, we can track those shifts. This one is way more expensive and time consuming though. Again, you need to be able to track people for years and years. So that in and of itself can be really challenging. In addition to that, there is the possibility that participants choose to withdraw. Some people just simply don't like being followed up with every year. Some people take pride in being in one of these studies, so you sort of have both ends of the spectrum. But if a lot of people choose to withdraw, which they have the right to do, those individuals could be telling a really interesting story about your topic, but because they've chose to withdraw, they might never obviously reflect in the results. So you could get a somewhat tainted result, depending on what you're studying, if enough important participants with interesting stories and interesting life experiences choose to withdraw, then you're not going to get the full picture of development. If 25, 30, 40, 50, 60% of your participants withdraw because they choose to. So as a mnemonic here, now that we've talked about both of these, we're going to zoom back out. These are the last two little bits to talk about. With a cross-sectional study, I really isolate the word section. It's a section of time. We're going to study just today, different people at different ages. We're going to get 15-year-olds, 25-year-olds, and 30-year-olds. And just today, on today's date, we are going to look at any differences. Might not do a good job taking into consideration technological shifts that those different age groups experience, but nevertheless, it's still part of the research that can be conducted. Or we're going to study the same amount of people, the same group of people over a very long period of time. Thus, we're going to isolate the word long and longitudinal.